My name is Dustin Siggins with Proven Media Solutions, and I'm with Ellie Krasne from Krasne Strategies. And we're going to be discussing today how to use nonprofit communications to drive your narrative while avoiding political polarization. Ellie, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Like Dustin said, I am Ellie Krasne, the founder and principal of Krasne Strategies. Our niche is helping mission-driven organizations use marketing communications to amplify their work so that everyone knows what they do and why they do it. I am really excited for this conversation today. I consider Dustin a colleague and a friend, and he and I think, are going to share some helpful insights.
So when it comes to political polarization, organizations that you think would be able to avoid that would be nonprofit charities. I'm Catholic. Catholic institutions, though, can be controversial in the Biden administration on abortion and in the Trump administration on immigration. Ellie is Jewish. Nonprofits can be controversial there because of relationships to Israel or whether they support or oppose specific policies of the Israeli government.
Absolutely. And that's just amongst the Jews.
Right. Well,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Dustin, if I could just put a fine point on what you just shared, and there are a lot of organizations that are faith-based or perhaps even not faith-based that have a mission and serve a community that might have nothing to do with whether the blue team or the red team is in the White House, but nevertheless, it can feel like the media narrative and on all over social media, there's a lot of pressure to maybe respond to things that have like a lot of political charge. So Dustin and I are going to talk about some ways that organizations can stay true to themselves, continue sharing the great work they do, but avoid some of that in the media.
that's right. And so let's talk for a minute. Let's sort of kind of set the stage a little bit from a strategic perspective. A lot of organizations feel like they have to respond to everything. I gotta track everything. They gotta say it. They've got to do it. What is the most important thing that a nonprofit should be thinking about when it's trying to drive a narrative?
Absolutely. So I'm going to cheat on the answer and say there are two things that I encourage all my clients to think about. And one is the impact they make, and two is the people they serve. And I think that if organizations and the communications and marketing professionals who come alongside them can always kind of look to those two questions as their true north, I think that in and of itself can help us avoid a lot of the many sand traps that exist out there.
Sure. And there's narratives, there are people, there's data, there are facts, there's history, there's forward looking. How do you help your nonprofit clients think about the most important things that their core audiences want to hear about?
Absolutely. So you just said the word and that I like to walk back from, and that's audience. So think about who are we trying to reach with this particular story? So by way of example, I work with one Jewish organization. They do fantastic work. I won't get into details here, but a lot of the people who benefit from what they do, they are boomers. They are the 60-year-old and up crowd. So whenever we talk
Sure.
about the
Mhm.
media that we're trying to target or messaging on social media, we always try to remember that a lot of the people who they're serving, it's a 65-year-old person who's retired or nearing retirement. It could be a Jewish retiree who could be living in a rural or southern part of America that really cares about Jewish life, but might not have in-person access to as much Jewish stuff as we'd see in Miami and New York. So if you think of Carol in Kansas City or whoever
Sure.
your marketing avatar is. I don't like the word marketing avatar, but you get the
The
idea.
persona.
Thinking
Right.
about the persona and walking it back from there, I think can really help guide that. And when we think of Carol in Kansas City, who cares a lot about Jewish literature, well, that
Right.
helps us understand what kind of publications she might read, what posts she might click on LinkedIn or Facebook. Did I answer your question, Dustin?
Well, and again, the key here, right? So many people think everything has to be about politics. And one of the things we
Mm-hmm.
tell our clients, whether they're non-profit, for-profit, or political, is you don't actually have to engage in politics when
No.
everybody else is. And so it's really important that I think we want to talk to those people, the soup kitchens, the nursing homes, the small private local schools
Hmm.
who might just be looking and going, man, my grant's at risk. If they shut down this federal agency, what's going to happen to my revenue? This donor is getting bad press because 92% of their donations are to groups like us, but
Yeah.
8% goes to a partisan organization. And so, let's move down our agenda a little bit because it's easy to get caught up in today, but one thing we tell our clients, and I know you do as well,
Yeah.
marketing and branding are long-term plays. And being quiet now doesn't mean you're quiet forever. And as we'll discuss in a few minutes, being quiet publicly doesn't mean being quiet to your core target audiences.
Yeah, absolutely. So you touched on something that I think is really important. And just because there is something in the news cycle, and maybe it does or doesn't affect your nonprofit, you don't have to respond to it publicly. Your goal as an organization, when it comes to marketing and communications, is to share your narrative and share the value that you bring. And yes, it might
Mhm.
feel like on Twitter or Blue Sky or wherever you are, there's a lot of stuff kind of swarming around, but
Yep.
that's kind of okay. You have a great opportunity to sit back and not engage with it, but instead kind of identify the story that you want to tell. And I always like to use the term bloom where you're planted. So maybe it seems like something's really, really hot, like in the news,
Mhm.
maybe something about grant funding, and that
Mhm.
can affect a nonprofit organization, absolutely. But maybe that's a great time to create some content on LinkedIn or Facebook or in your monthly newsletter that talks about some recent wins,
Mhm.
the value that you're driving. And if it's appropriate and you're working with a development team, then maybe there is a call to action in terms of donations. But the point of the matter is you don't have to respond to whatever political thing is happening in the news cycle. You want to continue that really long-term play of sharing the value that you create.
And one phrase I've kind of taken on in the last few months is there are a lot of hot takes,
Yeah.
but a value take is actually going to be more important because uh, someone who gets a lot of hot takes wrong eventually will be exposed. Whether they're exposed in the big picture is a little bit different, but within your target audiences, eventually they're going to figure it out. Whereas if you had a value take, it's forward-looking commentary, it's data, it's facts, it's compelling stories, it's something as simple as we grew by this much and had this much impact.
Yes.
When you have a hot take, it will actually be much more valuable because you've built a reputation on not being the person who cried wolf, the person who reacted to every little thing that's out there.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Dustin. And I think it is like what you were talking about a little bit, the value takes. And so when we
Yeah.
focus our time and our energy on that, which let's be honest, whether we're a nonprofit or for a business, those time is a limited resource. We have
Yes.
a chance to double down on the things that are going to have a positive ripple effect. And I think that brings us to the next thing that you and I were going to talk about.
Exactly.
But if that time and effort is spent on creating those stories, sharing the impact that your organization makes, and
Right.
you put a lot of effort in the front end on that, there's going to be a very positive ripple effect, because those stories can then be turned into newsletters. Some might even have narratives that are helpful in a grant. It can be content for social media. And sometimes, when and where appropriate, if the news cycle's right, it might make its way into a media pitch or an opinion piece that you're pitching out.
Let me ask you about that. And I'm sorry, everybody. I need to go turn my light on. I'm still figuring out all my detailed processes here, and I forgot to turn the light on before I started.
Do what you got to do.
So that does bring us to a lot of nonprofits have limited resources. And we're going to talk in a minute about surround sound marketing and branding.
Yep.
This is where you are beaming your narrative for everybody. And you talked about grant writing. I mean, let's actually talk about that. I'm wondering if we can switch our agenda here a little bit because grant writing is at the core of what you're looking for, right? We're talking here about getting grants from the government, from private orgs, getting money from donors. Let's talk about how surround sound marketing and branding can impact donors and grant providers, right? So when we say surround sound marketing and branding, imagine you're watching a movie at a movie theater. It's not like the 1940s where it's just black and white, right? You're also watching color, right? So it's gone from being just a flat screen that's black and white. Now it has noise in 1930s. Then it has color in the 1940s. Then they added new speakers on the sides and behind you. And then they added music to it as well. So when you know it's an action scene and subtly you're being affected not just on your ears from the sound itself, but the types of sounds that are on the screen and the facial expressions. That is surround sound marketing and branding. Let's dive into that on how that affects someone who's trying to get a grant or get a donation. How does that play into the touch points before the grant is request is put together, the RFP is put together, or how it affects the person who's making those decisions as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So if it's all right, I want to pivot just a
Hmm.
tiny bit and kind of set aside the grant writing for now, because
Oh,
that's
okay.
really like its own niche thing, how you work
Sure.
with foundations or government grants. So I'll kind of put that
Mhm.
on a shelf for now, although it's a
Sure.
good point.
Yep.
When we give potential donors or even coalition partners or allies, just people who are generally supportive of our work, multiple touch points, it gives them an opportunity to understand what we do, why we do it, and
Yep.
how they can help us. I think sometimes in the nonprofit space, we
Yes.
have to think about the people who can help us is not just people who are very generously giving, which of course
Mhm.
is wonderful, but there are people who are community leaders, there are advocates. Maybe there are other people who do similar work, but they offer the service in a different way. So they can kind of serve the same community in a different way. But the bottom line is, all of those people, I'll just broadly call them allies and supporters. When they
Mhm.
see you show up on LinkedIn, they see you on Facebook, maybe they see an article about your organization in the local newspaper. And I know we're going to talk about
Sure.
local outlets in a little bit. I
Yep.
think it really helps them understand what it is they can do to help advance your mission because they're better understanding you. The last thing that I'll say about it is if we think of ourselves, like maybe just when we hear about a new local restaurant in our neighborhood or a new
Mhm.
kind of shoe or something,
Sure.
how many times did you have to see that in your Instagram
Mhm.
feed or show up on Facebook or whatever
Right.
before you finally said, huh, that's an interesting kitchen gadget, or hey, hon, do you want to check out that restaurant this weekend? It was
Right.
multiple times. And we have
Correct.
to think of our nonprofit organizations in that regard as a little bit like businesses, that we just have to give people those touch points in multiple different ways, different places, so that they eventually take action and engage with us.
So let's a couple of more things here on strategic, and then we're actually going to dive more deeply into the point of this LinkedIn Live,
Yeah.
which is to talk about political polarization, how nonprofits can stay out of, they have to engage, they have to be out there, but
Yep.
not in the wrong ways. So to wrap up on what you're saying here is you really have to be out there, not just viewing people as giving you money, but they're investing in your success and the charity work that you're doing and in the people you're serving, right?
Yes.
And so, you know, when you're talking strategically, philosophically about the communication strategy, um, how much do you, Ellie, advise your nonprofits? Everyone has seasonality. Education nonprofits get more attention in May, June, August, September because of the school year. Donations are heavier in the holiday season. If you're a tax accountant, again, look at a business analogy. You really want to talk about what you do in March, not at Thanksgiving. So,
Mhm.
how does seasonality impact, again, big picture strategic thinking for nonprofits, in your opinion?
Absolutely. So it depends a little bit on the nonprofit, like you said, but absolutely it is seasonal. A great example is the Jewish organizations I work with. Usually around the month of September, there are a lot of Jewish holidays where more observant Jews are not, they're not logging in, they're not reading things. So that's a time where we actually have to plan our communications well in advance so
Hmm.
that we are getting ahead of those holidays.
Sure.
Somewhat similarly, if someone is a public interest legal group, even if they are not necessarily working on a case that's at the Supreme Court, we just want to be aware of when those court decisions are going to be coming
Sure.
out or argued,
Mhm.
because a lot of the legal reporters are going to be all SCOTUS all the time. It doesn't mean that we totally back off, but we just have to be really mindful of where we're pitching and when.
Sure. And so you just mentioned Supreme Court, but again, most 98% of nonprofits are soup kitchens. They're nursing homes, they're schools, and they're helping people and they have nothing to do with politics. They may have a
Right.
donor who's political. They may get a government grant from a more likely under a blue administration than a red administration or vice versa. So one of the things that I recently wrote was how to get clients in the press without talking about Trump. Donald Trump especially really sucks all the air out of the room in the news cycle. And
Yeah.
yet, what we were able to do, and I interviewed a few, other PR professionals about this, was one, go local, right?
Yes.
Avoid national politics by talking about your local industry, the sort of local community wants to hear, because especially in the last 7 years, local outlets really stopped caring about national news because anyone in their local community can get that news somewhere else.
Yep.
But if you're in Northern Virginia, you still care about your highway. You still care about the building over here or the business that went out of business or the healthcare company that made 3 new hires and you knew one of them. That's way more important for your local news to cover than another iteration of what you're already seeing at the New York Times or CBS or national influencers.
Yep.
You said you had some success with that in the Des Moines Register. Can you talk a little bit about how going local, Des Moines Register being a statewide outlet, but the same principle, going local, going to the state outlets helped the nonprofit?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few years ago, I wrote an opinion piece for the Des Moines Register. It was about some school choice issues in the state of Iowa, where I grew up. And just for context, I've published numerous times in national outlets, like numerous times. After this one was published, I received emails from people. I received Facebook messages. Some were thrilled, some less thrilled.
Sure.
But the
Yeah.
organization for whom I was writing, they actually got an unsolicited donation in response to my op-ed. Now, that is a little bit exceptional that a donor saw a piece of earned media and decided to give. But I think this example, Dustin, really drives home your point that sometimes going into that local media can actually be the most bang for your buck, because to your
Hmm.
point, the people reading it really care
Hmm.
about that issue. So if your
Right.
organization is a soup kitchen that serves, I don't know, like Central Nebraska or
Right.
whatever,
Right.
maybe the Lincoln Journal Star is a really good place to try to get in, because the community
Hmm.
reading that cares a lot about the work that you do. And to your point, when we're looking at national media, the stories happening at the national level are available in any number of places, albeit in
Right.
different ways. But when
Correct.
we go local and we go specific, we're targeting
Hmm.
a really, really bought in audience. So
Sure.
absolutely local media.
Well, and to tie that back to what we're already talking about, there's stuff in the political arena, but you
Hmm.
also may have stakeholders who aren't political. Rodney
Yes.
Ekstrom has asked a question here. Rodney directs alumni relations for my alma mater, Plymouth State
Okay.
University in New Hampshire. And right now there's a big discussion about how much might the university systems in New Hampshire lose their state funding. New Hampshire, historically, the state government has given the least amount of funding to states, universities, and colleges of any state in the country. And they might
Okay.
lose a significant portion of that. And so it's very controversial. On campus, students are upset. Professors, faculty, and staff are upset. But the administration now, the campus administration, has to try to talk to donors. They have to try to talk to students' parents. This is where I think it's really important to remember that, in Rodney's case, his audience is primarily alumni and donors.
Hmm.
But to what you said earlier, they're trying to help students. So I would say here, Plymouth State University needs to show the impact that they're having on students and student success and what that means. And I think that can be done through, of course, digital, but also the local press we're talking about. It can be done by hitting the social media and all those digital marketing tools so that everybody across the board, every audience is being hit with the same narrative. Plymouth State is doing good things
Hmm.
tailored to their specific interest area. How does that align with what your strategic thinking would be for this sort of
Yeah, it
scenario?
absolutely does, because the people who live in New Hampshire
Mhm.
are probably going to really care about the amount of funding that their universities get, whether it's the red or the blue team in the White
Sure.
House.
Right.
One thing that I'll just kind of gently offer on this is, in addition to local media, thinking about like really niche media or trade publications. So this is just
Sure.
kind of a
Yep.
brainstorm, and I don't know much about this school, but let's say, for example, maybe there's a university that serves a lot of students who are non-traditional. So maybe
Right.
they're people who go to school later in life. Maybe they served in the military and they're going to school, and they
Sure.
serve a really large population of that.
Yep.
If there is a website or a blog or some publication that serves like military veterans or
Smart. Yep.
something about that, that is a really, really great target because again, those
Right.
readers are really care. And also, I think, and I'm sorry that we didn't touch on this, the readers need your input. The readers need your expertise. So
Mm.
there's really a
Mhm.
chance to target a good audience there.
Right. No, that's a good point. And Plymouth State actually got some 8 years ago when the current president took over. They switched from the traditional education model to a cluster model.
Okay.
And that made news at inside higher ed. It made in news at the education trade outlets. But I really like your point here. A huge percentage of Plymouth State students are first generation college students. So
Okay.
they can then maybe reach those outlets that talk about that, whether it's immigration, whether it's rural, whether it's urban. They can talk about how they're trying to increase the number of minority students on campus. There's a lot of
Absolutely.
outstate and southern New Hampshire students who are not interested in Plymouth State because it is a predominantly white campus. So there's a
Hmm.
lot of trying to increase that student diversity. So to your point, that's where you can really dive into those niches, and then you can take those social media posts, those graphics, those that earned media, and then you bring it back to the donors. You can show
Yep.
the donors, these students are having these successes, these wins athletically, academically, etc. So I think that's a really good point, Ellie. And again, ties into the idea of there is a political issue, budget cuts. But
Yep.
if all you do is hammer away at that, then all you're doing is creating a war rather than driving forth a positive, forward-looking narrative. And again, the same thing is, again, if someone's losing their grant because of USAID, sure, you may want to have some public facing, hey, we deserve this money, or we deserve the grant, or this is you're hurting people by not having that grant. But you can't create a war because the people who control the purses obviously have a different opinion than you do.
Absolutely. And I think this is what you're saying, Dustin. Most of these nonprofits, in fact, probably all of them, they are not avatars or mouthpieces for the red or the blue team. And while it
Right.
is true that certain policies will affect them, and I want to make sure I'm showing concern about that, that's very, very real. Their job in the world is to serve their community. So, and
Yes.
I think again, it goes back to kind of what we were talking about at the top of this call that like it can feel really hard when we open Twitter or
Yes.
even Facebook and we see all these things coming
Yep.
at us. But just remembering the mission of your organization and who you serve and how you can continue sharing that and not feeling like you have to be, the a team player for the red or the blue team.
Well, and that actually brings us to our next point quite
Yeah.
organically, which is silence is a really, really powerful weapon
Oh,
when
yeah.
trying to drive a narrative. Um, if you are trying to drive a narrative that you are nonpartisan, responding to USAID cuts, it might be the appropriate thing to do to get a grant or to speak up for those within your specific nonprofit niche. But also, you might be now attaching yourself to red or blue. And
Hmm.
so, silence doesn't mean, of course, no communication. It might just mean
Yep.
you're not out there responding in the press. Because again, I actually wrote on this a few years ago. Public opinion can be very harsh, but it also
Yes.
moves on really, really fast.
Bingo.
And you see this all the time where in 2020, Trader Joe's was pressured to change their ethnic name. Now, again, they're a for-profit, but the example should carry over. That and it was a summer of protests and a lot of sensitivity to various issues. A college student had 120 people sign her change.org petition to have Trader Joe change their ethnic names. It went viral, got national media attention because of the surrounding culture challenge that was going.
Right.
And Trader Joe said, "No, we're not going to listen to you. We listen to our customers." For all intents and purposes, they kept their mouth shut.
Yeah.
Five Guys has been under pressure because their prices have gone up like everybody else. And when people post expensive receipts online and attack the company says nothing because
Yep.
they know that most of their audiences are not these digital trolls. And so to pivot to the nonprofit, silence publicly doesn't mean no communication. It simply means you're not creating self-inflicted injuries by
Yes.
inserting yourself inappropriately. The government affairs team is maybe behind the scenes Maybe you're out there talking positively about what you're doing and how you do it. Process is so important to show credibility and ethics. How else would you suggest using silence as a nonprofit communication tool?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I just want to start by reiterating what you've said, which is sometimes not responding to the more divisive, politically charged things in the news cycle is the most effective thing that an organization can do. The question that I like to ask myself and ask my clients is, if we respond to this, what is the upside? And if
Yeah,
you can't
right.
readily think of the
Yep.
upside,
Hmm.
that might be your market signal to back down. The
Yes.
second thing I'll say about it is you talked about this, but sometimes the news cycle moves on really quickly.
Hmm.
It's okay to give it 2 or 3 days, maybe even 4, and just see if the facts come out. And if the
Hmm.
facts coming out necessitate a response, often when we do that, the answer remains no. It doesn't mean there's not a time and a place, but I just wanted to remind our audience that we can kind of do those gut checks of like, what's the upside, and then letting more of the facts
Hmm.
come out. But to actually answer your question, because I'm going to do it, there are a couple of things people can do. And a big one is that shift to owned media. Just a little
Nice.
vocabulary
Yep.
lesson for our
Yes.
audience. All owned media means is it something that your team, or maybe you made with Dustin or myself,
Sure.
created?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's
yeah.
blogs, newsletters, a LinkedIn article, that kind of thing. So again, I'll use the visual of like you open Twitter, you open Blue Sky, and the tweets are tweeting or whatever. It is okay for your organization that, let's say, does ESL for adults or a soup
Sure.
kitchen,
Yep.
you do a post that says, the Easter season is rapidly approaching and we're reminded of the spiritual meaning of the holiday. Here's a story of how we serve our community, or
Sure. Yep.
here's a small story of how, maybe Anna moved here when she was 20, and through taking our English classes,
Yes.
she
Hmm.
was able to, grow and learn. So again, all this, it might be swarming around us, but that doesn't mean that you, nonprofit professional, can't just kind of let that swarm while you share a
Hmm.
story that's really compelling
Yes.
and meets your audience where they are.
Well, and along those lines too, we mentioned trolls a few minutes ago. Trolls are not usually your target audience. One of the keys here
Correct.
to knowing silence is knowing when to be silent and when not, right? So when I had an op-ed going to USA Today a couple years ago, and I had left of center friends say they liked it, right of center friends, friends down the middle. Well, some troll on TikTok didn't like it. His video attacking my company and me got 3.6 million views through TikTok. I got a few dozen spam messages through, LinkedIn, Facebook, a couple of emails. It had no impact on anything other than I'd hit unconnect or ignore a lot on Twitter. And
Yeah.
so that's 3.6 million views with zero, hang on, there's the camera, zero real impact. And so similarly, you should always have a plan. There's the idea of setting up, understanding your 4 or 5 or 10 greatest risks to your brand credibility. In this case, how the people who trust you to take care of them, the communities around you and your donors or grantors would see you. And of course, you want to prepare for those scenarios. But again, one of your tactics is always going to be silence where appropriate. And in this case, I didn't say anything. People, a bunch of bots attacked me, and a week later, everything was silent and back to normal.
Yeah, I would love to pause and talk a little bit about the trolls and engagement, because I think this is worth reminding everyone. So first of all, like you said, your target audience is not a troll. It's not the person
Right.
typing a rude comment or
Right.
doing the laugh emoji when you
Yes.
posted something actually heartfelt. Your target audience might be the person who is sitting there reading it and quietly nodding and clicking the save button because they
Right.
thought this was interesting.
Yes.
So I want to share that. Also, I was listening to a great podcast a few days ago, and they had a woman on who's a true expert in Facebook. And
Oh,
she was
yes.
talking about
Mhm.
how Facebook is
Yes.
actually moving its model away from prioritizing engagement to prioritizing views. So what
Right.
does that mean? What it means is that Facebook is looking at the total number of times somebody just simply saw your video, but there's
Mhm.
some other things that I think they're starting to track, which includes saves and also
Right.
how many times it was forwarded. Because hear me out.
Oh,
Dustin, let's say that you publish a really interesting LinkedIn post, and instead of people trolling it, they read it and they're like, wow, this is such a good point.
right. Of course. Right.
And they forward
Right.
it to their friends.
Yep.
Does that mean that your LinkedIn post didn't have value because people weren't saying, LOL, you're dumb? No, it's the
No, no.
opposite.
LinkedIn is doing something similar, where it's hard to tell. The algorithm has changed several times since
Yes,
last
it
summer,
changes a
and,
lot.
and no
Yep.
one's quite sure what's going on now. But generally speaking, impressions, which is, you saw something for a billionth of a second on your scroll, is
Yep.
worth, X percent. The algorithm rewards, though, the engagement, a like, a love, whatever, more. It rewards a comment even more, and a comment more than 15 words even more, but also dwell time. How long was somebody reading your post?
Right.
Right? So there's actually a whole strategy toward creating dwell time. And I was really concerned with the algorithm changes. A lot of my stuff was getting half the engagement, a third of the engagement it used to. But 2 weeks back, I connected with a number made it some new connections within my target audience. Every single one of them said, I'm glad we finally met. I've been following your stuff for a while, including an executive strategist who used to work directly with the CEO of a global corporation. So this,
Absolutely.
this is another example of what you're talking about, where, the people who are the quiet supporters, they're seeing your stuff. They may read the article, they'll get your email. Again, it's a part of it is just brand awareness. Some of it is hitting them at the right time, Easter or Christmas
Of
or
course.
the school year, whatever your strong signal season is, or we're about to lose money. This happened. It's not, any number of nonprofits, they'll maybe lose a grant. It gets made up for in the private sector because they've built that brand awareness. So again, to your point, Facebook is changing toward valuing things that it didn't value as much 5 years ago. And
Yes.
LinkedIn is creating this algorithmic preference system that, again, you might get 5 reposts. And I don't know the exact algorithm equation.
Sure.
5 reposts, but only 3 likes. But those 5 reposts are going to have way more value than those three likes. So you may have only gotten 8 engagements, but they were high value engagements.
Exactly. They're high value engagements. And that kind of takes me back to something that I encourage a lot of my clients to work on. In fact, all of them is building a newsletter. And I know we're getting a little bit away from what we talked
Every,
about.
People love their newsletters now. Everyone I talk to who's in digital marketing is focusing on newsletters.
So this is why. Um, it is a chance to share your story. You
Mhm.
have a captive audience. And I think we live in this world where there's so many different things coming at us in so many different ways that the newsletter is truly a precious resource and a way to share your story. And I will also say sometimes people have the question, well, I don't know who I would add to it. We don't have any people we
I
would
was
add.
going to ask that. Yep.
So absolutely. So start with what I call the friends and family package. And that doesn't mean that you add like the random person you had
Sure.
one coffee with off of Bumble 10 years ago. Act in good faith, people who want to hear about it.
Sure,
Um,
right.
but even if you start with 10, that's 10 people you might be emailing once a month or twice a
Sure.
month talking about what you do. And I don't want to get too much into like digital marketing funnels, but if you have a sign up for our newsletter on the website, or when,
Hmm.
people email you, you say, could you add us to your newsletter? Before you know it, you're going to have 50, 100, 200 people who are truly a captive audience. And then you can start looking at the data to see what do they click on? What do they open? I will just give this a
Oh,
little asterisk if it's okay. Um, be mindful about how often you send those newsletters. Obviously there's a whole, business science behind marketing cadences and how many
sure.
newsletters we send before we ask for a donation.
Hmm.
I am kind of the belief that our newsletter subscribers and those email addresses are some of our most precious resources.
Sure.
So
Hmm.
absolutely you can send those solicitation emails, but I think like anything else in business or sales, build that trust first and show that value before you start asking for money.
Well, that makes sense. And let's talk briefly. We've talked about owned media. You just, tied in newsletters. But let's also talk about the control you have over owned media versus earned and even paid, right? Because paid media, you control it. You're paying for the ad, whether it's a digital boost, whether it's a banner ad or the newspaper or a mailbox, you know, flyers. That's a paid ad, and you do control the message, but you don't always control who's seeing it. You're probably hitting, a million people with the radio ad, but your target audience might be 0.1% of that audience. But you want to hit your buyer, you want to hit their neighbor, you want to hit their friend, etc. Earned media, of course, is similar insofar as the reach. You may not control exactly the reach. Getting into the Wall Street Journal might be great if you're in the finance sector, or if you're in the nonprofit world, philanthropy today, inside higher ed if you're in education. But also, there's going to be a lot of people in those worlds who are not going to become a donor. They're not going to become a supporter. Whereas a newsletter or social media, you can curate who your followers are to a degree. You can unfollow people. You can use algorithm-friendly keywords to really key in on those people. So let's talk a little bit about the control importance in a newsletter.
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost is you have their email addresses. Obviously, we respect the unsubscribe feature, so whatever. But
Right.
it does, to your point, Dustin, you get to manage when do you talk to them, what do you say to them, or this isn't so much marketing and communications, it's more external affairs or outreach. If you want to send them a personal email, like, hey, we saw that you gave us like $50 donation or whatever, wanted to say hello and say thank you. So the point is, when you have the email address, you have a lot more control about how and where and when you communicate with them. If you have, let's say, 5,000 Instagram followers, which is great, whether you have 5,000, 50,000, you don't have their email address. So you are kind of at the behest of the Instagram employee computer person who does the algorithm. This was about a year ago, but there was a point at which, for some people, they were only actually reaching like 3% of their followers. And I'm not saying
Sure.
this to put down Instagram or beat up on them, but
Sure.
the point is, if the Instagram algorithm is suppressing the local soup kitchens
Yep.
posts, or I shouldn't say suppressing, but maybe favoring things that are a
Not
little bit
prioritizing.
more
Yeah.
spicy or whatever, the soup kitchen can't really reach their audience. But if the soup kitchen has the email addresses, really the only thing stopping
Oh.
them is like Gmail spam filters.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Right. So as the media bifurcates, for example, and there's fewer people reading each outlet or watching each outlet or listening to each radio station, and as social media algorithms change, Facebook 12 years ago, you could reach 97% of your audience for free. Last time I checked 3 or 4 years ago, you could reach 3% of your audience for free, to your point.
Exactly.
Whereas emails, except for spam filters and other relatively small factors, don't really change that much. An email is
Yep.
still an email.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think we've kind of tackled most of our agenda here. Is
Yeah.
anything else that you want to specifically address here? I mean, maybe we can talk a little bit more about some of the more controversial stuff that's out there. We talked about Plymouth State and state budget cuts. We've mentioned Doge. Um, you know, how do you advise your clients to what's the word I'm looking for? Create a funnel, a donor funnel, especially those larger donors. Again, a lot of these donors who get attacked for their political or their think tank donations or whatever. One guy in particular, I forget his name. He got reasonably criticized for some donations to some relatively controversial foreign policy think tanks. But his organization, 90% of the donations are to art museums and schools and truly apolitical, nonpartisan charities. So how do you advise to make sure that the organizations aren't relying on that, the four donors who are already in their basket? How do we create a more diversified donor funnel?
Yeah, absolutely. So this gets into a little bit more philanthropy and development strategy. I focus more on the marketing, but just at a high level, some things,
Sure.
and a lot of them relate to what we've talked about. So combining that earned and owned media. So
Hmm.
when you put your organization story in local media or specific trade publications, you are targeting a really bought-in audience. And because it's earned media, you're really building that credibility because a third party that you
Yes,
don't
of
pay
course.
any money
Right.
to is
Right.
saying, hey, this soup kitchen does really good work. And that
Yes.
gives your development team a lot of firepower because they can say, oh, the Des Moines Register
Mhm.
wrote about this or the Omaha World Herald.
Mhm.
So that's
Or
one
the
thing with the
ABC
earned
News has
media.
a video showcasing the people you're helping by name that you can then turn those into those other narratives.
Absolutely. And that's the second thing is the storytelling. So if you have people who've been positively impacted by the work you do, creating some nice little vignettes or stories, whether it's in a video form or even a quick series of paragraphs that you share on your website as success stories or impact stories, that's a really great thing to do. You can work with a professional web designer on this, but I cannot stress this enough. Having an easy newsletter sign up on your website. So that way, when people want to learn more, they can just go click.
Mhm.
That's a wonderful way to collect those email addresses and start to kind of create the framework for a robust and diverse pool of prospects.
Well, and also it's easy to people get scared, I think, because we have a prospect in the for-profit space. They're doing $100 million a year. They had secured a lot of business in their sector. They were growing
Mhm.
rapidly. They had opened up, new verticals and had new team hires and a lot of different things. And they told us, we don't do enough to do press every month. Any company doing, any organization doing 100 million a year has enough for every single possible marketing and branding vertical of any type. But a lot of nonprofits, I think, look and say, well, we're not doing anything special. This is the same thing we do every day. So one of the things we've been encouraging, I actually wrote several pieces on how to turn everyday work into, brand building gold, right? Marketing and
Yes.
branding gold. So you're a banker, you have a loan, probably make 100 loans a day. But if that loan is to a big local business that's expanding from a 5,000-foot warehouse to a 50,000-foot warehouse, well, that's going to be earned media because the local press is going to cover it and you want to be there at the ribbon cutting. There's going to be video there because they're going to have a shindig to celebrate the grand opening of their new headquarters, and you want to be there shaking hands, getting the credit for providing the earned capital, the
Yeah.
financial capital. And of course, it turns into your newsletter, your social, and everything else that you're doing. So, how do you how do you encourage people to think about making sure that what they do every day, they see it as valuable collateral for the grant donor audience?
So again, that gets into a little bit of like development and grant writing. But I think there are some truisms that we can use in newsletters or marketing or even like media pitches to print media. I think first and foremost, it's the communications professional, whether you have an internal team or you're working with some
Mhm.
outside support like you or I, really sitting down with them and understanding what it is they do. Because sometimes when we talk to that
Yes,
other
yes.
person, we can start to discover things
Mhm.
that maybe we just didn't see before, and they can reflect it back to us. So that's the
That's a
first
good
thing. I
point.
would also say, and I think this is kind of where you're going, for a lot of businesses and nonprofits, the seemingly everyday things are very interesting to people on the outside.
Yes.
As
Yep.
a person, I have this a little bit too. Like I happen to live in Paris, France, which
Right.
if you ask me, I think it's the least interesting thing about me. But what I've learned is
Right.
that when I post things on LinkedIn that have like a little picture of a thing I was at where they had champagne, or I went to this like thing on
Mhm.
Wednesday that had croissant. Like if I share that on LinkedIn with a little story about the work I do, it gets a decent amount of impressions and likes. And I've started doing it in my newsletter. So if
Right.
you're the soup kitchen and you want to do an interview with if they're comfortable, even an intern, do a quick little interview with an intern and
Mhm.
show a picture of he or she
Yep.
smiling at their desk. Or if you do,
Right.
you're an organization that teaches ESL, and if the class feels comfortable, share a photo of a volunteer teaching the class. That is a wonderful, wonderful way to share your story. And I
Mhm.
cannot stress this enough. People on the outside think it is so
And
cool. Do
well,
not sleep on the great stuff you do every day.
and I put this on something related to this on LinkedIn a few weeks back, and someone put it really well that the accountant is the most boring person in the room if they're the only accountant. The lawyer is
Oh,
the
I
most
like
interesting person in
that.
the room if they're the only lawyer. If you're the only, college that's doing clusters, you might be the most interesting person in the room. And, if you're the only soup kitchen in your town, you're the most interesting soup kitchen in the town.
Yeah.
And so I do think it's really important to make sure that as you're thinking about your donor funnel, again, I'm not a financial strategist for nonprofits. I'm a PR guy. But as you think about that grantor or that donor, they want, or they're giving $10 or 10,000, they want to see impact. So if you
Yes.
can show we are helping in these ways in everyday fashions, you're going to find really, really interesting stories. And you're going to find that people care more about those stories than you would have thought, because especially if you can frame it in a way, we call it counterintuitive, but that stands out. If everyone
Yeah.
in your industry is funny, be dry. Our website, for example, is very basic because many PR firms have whiz bang websites and everything moves and there's white on orange and I'm oblivious to half of it, but we have a simple website. A lot of nonprofits, you know, maybe you don't have the best website, to your point, Ellie. You may not have a professional video, but you have photos, you have basic videos, you have a newsletter, you have that drumbeat local coverage once a month because you do 4 soup kitchens every month, or you have new people coming in with new technology you just started using. You don't have to have it be super whiz bang. It just has to
Yeah.
tell that narrative story that drives from what you're doing every day, and it reaches donors, grantors, community leaders, etc., through all of the tools of surround sound marketing and branding, from earned media to paid media to social media and your newsletter. Let's wrap up on this.
Sure.
Nonprofits are notorious for having a lot of volunteers and small staffs who are not specialists in the things we're talking about.
Yes.
One of the things we at the beginning, it was actually the beginning of our agenda that we didn't really talk too much about, is when you are looking strategically at your narrative and your donor
Hmm.
funnels, etc., repurposing content. We've touched on it a little bit here and there throughout this conversation. Can you give a good sort of, let's say, narrative here of how to repurpose content 5, 6, 7 times without having $200,000 in professional support?
Absolutely. So if it's okay, I'll just use myself as an example.
Sure. Yep.
So what I do for my business is I have a monthly newsletter, probably not a surprise. And I obviously send the newsletter to my list. I
Right.
then take that and I put it on my website under insights and
Hmm.
how-tos. So that
Hmm.
way I'm getting the SEO, or anyone who would like to learn more about my work can easily see kind of what I've been up to and get an update. I
Hmm.
then take that and I divide that content into little different paragraphs or vignettes that I share throughout the month on LinkedIn as LinkedIn posts.
Sure. Yep.
Your organization can do something different. I'll give you an example of one of my clients. A lot of times what we do when we have a press release over something that's really big is we obviously send the press release to our list. We make
Sure.
sure to post it to the website. We post it on the appropriate social channels as well. But then again, similarly, we kind of just grab little parts of it and reshare that on social media so that we're continuing to shout that win or share that really big
Yes.
update, but we
Yep.
don't have to do a bunch of different things. The
Yes.
last thing I'll say about that is for that same organization, when we send a newsletter,
Yep.
sometimes we take the press release little blurbs and we just
Yep.
include them as a section of the newsletter. So it'll be like, this legal case, blah, 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 this legal case, blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
So that I
Yep.
think is a really great way of saying one press release, many, many different ways to share it.
And similarly, this LinkedIn live conversation, Ellie and I are both going to have a Zoom recording. I'm sure we'll both cut clips and repurpose it for LinkedIn and repurpose it for our newsletters. And I've used past op-eds because they could become LinkedIn content. They become part of the newsletter. They can, anything can be reused as long as you have a strategy, a plan, and you know the right tools that fit for you. If you don't have a
Yes.
big budget, paid media may not be your game. If you don't have a highly professional, video team, maybe you don't want to do 10 best clips at the end of the year, but what you can do throughout the year is have the handheld camera, every week showing a few minutes. Because again, you have that funnel of that video becomes part of your social, your newsletter, your website content. Maybe you hold a webinar on best practices. So you can be seen as a thought leader in the community.
Yeah.
And that video gets sent to the local news. When you have 3 months of videos and stories to tell, that becomes that news, part of the news cycle. That's 5 reuses of a 3-minute iPhone camera.
Yes, and if
They're
I
all
could just quickly say
go,
something
jump.
about that,
Mhm.
there are so many great websites like Unsplash that have free stock photos.
Yes, good
If you
point.
want paintings,
Mhm.
the Metropolitan Museum of Art has some open access ones that you can download
Really?
if that's relevant to your work. However, when we live in this highly digital world, I
Mhm.
really think the kind of authentic, sweet photos that the intern or the comms assistant
Yes,
took with their iPhone
yes.
stand out in such a fantastic way. And if it's all right, Dustin, one more
Go.
thing. Canva now has some really cool ways you can make videos. So you can
Mhm.
upload your own photographs or logo or whatever, and Canva kind of plugs it into a video. So I know all my video editors right now who are listening are like, oh God, she's using that. But you can do that pretty easily and have a video that it's not the same production you might see for like a Super Bowl ad, but it
Right.
totally is an honest 20-second video that highlights your organization. So just wanted to share those tips for folks who
Right.
might be working on a little bit of a modest budget.
Well, and again, most nonprofits are, whether they
Yes.
look like it on the outside or not. In fact, most small businesses are. And so to your point, my backdrop here with my name and company and everything, it costs $400. And I can reuse it, until Zoom upgrades enough that it's no longer usable. But I've gotten 3 years of use out of it.
Yeah.
And so there are ways to certainly add to that credibility. And with today's digital tools, you can do so much. Canva is an amazing tool for the um, aesthetically ignorant like myself. And so, being able to use these tools can really help the leadership at a nonprofit set up that marketing and branding, surround sound marketing and branding strategy to create that donor funnel.
Yeah,
So let's
absolutely.
wrap
Well, I
here.
know we're getting to time. Do we
Yes.
want to kind of end on a few tips?
Yeah. Well, I think the most important tip is just because everyone else is yelling doesn't mean you have to. Because again, we're
Yeah.
talking about avoiding the political, controversies. Don't shoot yourself in the foot. Be silent more often than you think, and be prepared for when you shouldn't be silent. That's how
Yes.
I'll end. Go ahead. I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have three, and I actually wrote them down right
Of
here.
course you did.
Great organizations, they use owned and earned media. So,
Yes.
they pitch to reporters, but they
Mhm.
also write those blog articles and the newsletters. Value takes are always better than hot takes.
Yes.
And the last one is silence is golden.
Yes. Well, thank you, folks. Ellie Krasne with Krasne Strategies and Dustin Siggins, their Proven Media Solutions. Feel free to hit us up, reach out to us on LinkedIn. We'll be in touch. Thank
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. Thanks, Dustin.